So then moving on in Heidegger to chapter 5, being in as such. Note that the book is structured in two halves. The first half is Division 1, the preparatory fundamental analysis of Dasein, and that's composed of 6 chapters. We're on the 5th here. The 6 chapters are the exposition of the task, and then being in the world in general, the worldhood of the world, the they, and then being in as such, which is where we're at now, and then after that comes chapter 6 on care. That ends the first half of the book. Then the second half of the book is about Dasein and temporality, so it moves into 6 more chapters on the relationship of Dasein to time, and all of that was supposed to be a big part 1 with more discussion that he never got to, so he didn't finish the book. But we're almost, but not quite there, to the halfway point. So in this chapter we look at being in as such. So we're back to, we've moved from an analysis of the worldhood of the world and the who in that world, namely the they, to being in as such. And he says in the introduction of this chapter that Dasein is to be thought of as a bridge, as it were, a commerce, a commercium between the present in hand subject and the present in hand object. It's the sort of bridge between subject and object. It is the being of the between, as he says. And note, too, that the way that he uses the word being, I think here in Being in Time, is different from the way that he uses it later to characterize specific epochs, and each epoch has a different understanding of being, where at this time I think he's using being in a more general way to refer to the being of this or that mode of existence, or this or that, the way things are. They're not only just the 3 modes of being of present at hand, ready to hand, and Dasein, but he also said in the previous chapter about the they. For example, the being of the they is publicness, he says. And so Dasein is the being of the between the subject and object. So being has a kind of essentialistic connotation in the way that he uses it here. Then so he proceeds to analyze what he calls the existential constitution of the there. The there is where, simply where, spatially, Dasein finds itself. Dasein always is the there. It brings the there with it in a primordial sense, but the existential constitution of the there-ness of Dasein has certain structures to them that he wants to analyze. And the first of those structures are actually, there are 2 of them that this chapter has in mind. The chapter itself is divided in half, with the first half, A, being the existential constitution of the there, and the second half going back to retrieving some of the discussion of inauthenticity regarding falling and idle talk and gossip and the dissipation of energies that are necessary for the living of an authentic life that are dissipated through various means. But the first half has to do with the understanding and intelligibility and the way the mind works in the construction of a world. The second half of this chapter has to do with its dissipation and the energies which dissipate and dissolve it for that world creative constitutive task. So the chapter has a very definite structure to it. Sometimes when you're reading Heidegger, if you're not careful to step back and look at the topology as a whole, you might think that the discussions are random. They're not. They're structured in a very particular way. And then with regard to the there are 2 constitutive existential features. What is called Befindlichkeit, which is translated here as state of mind, but which is translated in the history of the concept of time as disposition, and refers to mood, basically, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, understanding. So we have understanding and state of mind as the 2 things that he's going to focus on to reveal the constitutive existential nature of Dasein's being in a world. And for the first aspect of the state of mind reveals, the state of mind is characterized by mood. And Heidegger, I think, in many ways, is the first philosopher who brings in emotion and mood into philosophy as something that is of ontological significance, because mood matters. He says in this chapter, mood, which in German is Stimmung, which originally in German also refers to the tuning of a musical instrument. And so your mood is a fundamental attunement that you have to the world that you're in, and it reveals the mood, whether it's one of elevation, whether it's one of dread, whether it's one of anxiety or one of depression, can reveal all sorts of things about your ontological situation in the world that you're in. So moods are ontologically significant. They tell a lot about Dasein and the way in which Dasein finds itself thrown into the world. And so what he moves into here is a discussion then of mood as revealing the thrownness, and the German word is Geworfenheit, the thrownness of Dasein into a particular there. The there is simply a particular time, particular place, particular cultural circumstances, with a particular facticity. Facticity is, of course, if we think of a stone and we think of a tree. A stone, as he says later in World, Finitude, and Solitude, the stone is worldless, and the tree, I suppose, also would be worldless as well. And so they have brute factuality characterizing their nature. But the human being, the Dasein, is not worldless, but is primarily a world builder and uses language to construct. Language is the house of being, as he says in the Letter on Humanism, to construct a world in a particular time and place with particular cultural traditions and understandings that have facticity to them. So the nature of the human world is one of facticity, not mere brute factuality, because the Dasein, the human being, is embedded in a world, whereas the stone and the tree and those things in nature, in the natural world, which are merely present at hand as entities, presumably just standing around, are not. So the thrownness that is revealed here, I think, is a very interesting concept. It basically means that you find yourself in a particular time and in a particular place. The mood that you're in reveals the essential thrownness of the there-ness of where you're at. Dasein always finds itself somewhere and under a particular set of circumstances that give to it its limitations, basically, for the tasks that it has to set about. The task is going to be world building. It's always world building for Heidegger. That's what the human being does for Heidegger. Dasein is a world builder. And in this chapter, he's going to lay out all the tools that Dasein uses to construct his world. And thrownness is an interesting concept to me. And I think it was Hans Jonas who wrote the book The Gnostic Religion, who was one of Heidegger's pupils, who said that he sensed in the concept of thrownness a kind of Gnostic, a hidden Gnostic connotation in Heidegger, and I think that's dead on. In fact, if you think of it, basically, thrownness, we find ourselves thrown into a particular time and in a particular place, and that gives to us our destiny. Our destiny, it gives us limitations about where we're at, limitations that are imposed upon us, and it imposes upon us a destiny that we have to work with. We have to work with the limitations of where we're at, always. There's a kind of karmic sound to it. And I think that if this were in a previous cosmology from the metaphysical age, we might almost say that thrownness has a semiotic vacancy behind it where there would have been in a previous metaphysical age something like one of the Gnostic archons. Because the question is, if we're thrown into the world, who's doing the throwing? Who or what has thrown us into the world? Heidegger doesn't answer that because this is he's moving us into the post-metaphysical age where you're not supposed to build cosmologies like that anymore, even though he is doing a type of cosmology building. But in the Gnostic cosmology, the archons, which are basically the planetary spheres and the intelligences assigned with each of the planetary spheres, construct your karma. They construct your subtle body. They put you into a body. They put your soul and build a body as a prison that captures your soul and thrusts you down into the world of matter. And it's done in a very malicious sense. The Gnostics did not have a happy view of the world. It was a pessimistic view of the world. And so you were thrown into the world by the Gnostics. And I think that, in Hindu mythology, it's karma. Karma determines where and when and how and why you're thrown into a particular set of circumstances. So I think that it's worth pointing out here that this thrownness has the ghost of scars of signifieds that would have been there from other cosmologies that would have had a metaphysical connotation, a cosmological, mythological connotation. And so the thrownness thing then is that we're to imagine it's passive, basically. When you're thrown into the world, something has been done to you. But so Heidegger presents the human being as thrown. Something has been done to him, so now how does he respond? The response to Geworfenheit, it turns out, the creative response, after he goes through a small section here on one of the primary moods, the mood of fear, he discusses that, and then he goes into being there as understanding. Now, there's a particular conception of understanding here, which is the response to the Geworfenheit problem, the problem of being thrown. Being there in its connection with understanding is that understanding does something. It's not a passive thing. It's not something that's just, by understanding, Heidegger really means a kind of pre-ontological understanding of your situation, where you're at, how you understand things and people around you, your world around you. But what understanding does is it projects. And the word there, the German word, is entwerfen. So we see the similarity between entwerfen and geworfenheit. They both contain the word werfen, which means to throw. But in the one case, you have been thrown into the world. Now with understanding, what understanding does with entwerfen is it projects worlds. It constructs and projects and creates worlds. That's the response to the fallenness, to the thrownness, rather, of geworfenheit that the human being does using the understanding. The understanding is the primary constitutive tool that the human being uses to construct and create a world. And what he says about the understanding is that it projects possibilities of being onto the world. These possibilities of being are things like ontical relations that particular beings will have with each other, meanings that will take place within this projection, so that the understanding is always projecting world horizons, and the human being himself is also projected within these projections, and hence the transcendental ego of, let's say, Husserl, does not pre-exist this projection. It's almost like the transcendental ego now is almost like an avatar that it incarnates itself into a world reality. And you can see the analogies here with the Hindu idea of Vishnu. I think it's not that far off, where Vishnu is the god who is asleep and dreams the world, projects it as a Maya dream, and incarnates his own ego within it as the great avatars of history. Matsya, the fish avatar, or Vishnu appearing as all the various avatars, the dwarf avatar, Vamana, and Rama, the great avatar of Vishnu of the Ramayana, and so forth. It's almost as the transcendental ego does not pre-exist the world that is projected, that is created by the understanding. It comes into being along with that world. It's a co-origination within Heidegger. So we can see what Heidegger's doing behind all the difficulty of the verbiage here, and this is a very difficult chapter to read, I admit, which is why I'm doing it as a series of videos instead of compressing it into one video, because there's a lot going on in here. And then he moves into one of the most difficult passages to understand in this chapter is understanding and interpretation, his theory of interpretation. So what he does is he moves from, note that he has moved from Dasein and the understanding and its disclosing of a world and its projecting of a world now to interpretation. So whereas understanding is global, we might say, interpretation is something that is local. It's a focused form of understanding for Heidegger. You have a pre-ontological understanding of your world. You know where things are at. You know what a book is. You know what a wall is. You know these people. You know where everything's at in this town. That's all a basic pre-ontological understanding. But even interpretation for Heidegger has a kind of pre-ontological nature to it, since he thinks that in order to interpret something, Auslegung is the word that he uses. In order to interpret something, you don't need to make assertions about it. It's pre-linguistic. You already know generally what something is when you're confronted with it, even if you don't have the conceptual vocabulary to properly capture what it is. When I hear a song that I've never heard before, or just let's say I hear a song, I don't first recognize it as a blur of notes. I recognize that it's music immediately. Or when I hear someone talking to me in a foreign language, it's not the case that I just hear a blur of words. I recognize a series of unintelligible words. So interpretation is always, there's a pre-ontological aspect to it in which it's basic. We're always interpreting. Everything we're doing is always interpreting. And the key to Heidegger's theory of interpretation is this idea of the use of the word as. We're always understanding things as something. As something. We understand A as B, or we understand this thing as a hammer, or that thing that connects the river as a bridge. So with interpretation is always an as something. And there are three different aspects to interpretation where we have, as he says, there are these a priori aspects to it. For having, we always have a sense of what it is that we're looking at before we know exactly what we're seeing. So there's always a kind of a prioriness about our interpretation. That's for having. And then we have, in addition to for having, we have foresight. I know what it is. I have it in my sight, what I'm going to interpret. I roughly know what it's going to be. And then there's foreconception, which is to say, I have to have certain concepts in order to apply them to what it is that I'm about to interpret. And the concepts make sense out of what I'm going to interpret. stop here.